Hi, and welcome to the very first episode of the Mind Unravelling podcast. And I'm very thrilled to have a truly inspiring guest with us here today, Miss Mimi. Just to tell you all a bit about Mimi. Mimi is an international best-selling author of Softening the Edge and Empathy at Work. And she's regarded as one of the pioneers of integrating empathy into the workplace and other business settings such as leadership and management. She has also been recently recognized as Malaysia's #1 workplace well-being leader. Mimi, it's an absolute honor for us to have you here today.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you so much. So just to start things off, I'd like to ask you, we're speaking from a small island nation where, our realities are anything but small, right? What does empathy even, mean here with the rising, with us being surrounded by the rising sea levels and the rising cynicism?
Look, I think that empathy has place wherever you are. So small island, big island, not an island, it doesn't really matter. What we're talking about is the ability to understand other people. So empathy is a skill set. It's a skill set that's built into your brain, into the prefrontal cortex of your brain. And it enables you to understand other people. And of course, if you're talking about rising sea, the countries, the nations, Mother Nature around us. So we're talking about a skill set that we're born with. And it enables us to create connection to other people, whether, like you said, whether it's in leadership, in the workplace, or in the world at large.
Right. Okay. That I'm curious about something. Since you've written and spoken extensively about leadership being used, about empathy being used as a leadership tool, do you have this fear, or do you think that it's somehow turned into a sort of a performance, or that it's thrown around as a sort of a buzzword for platforms like LinkedIn?
Probably. Probably. I mean, most things turn into a buzzword, whether you're talking about empathy or resilience or, flexibility. And there's a buzzword, vulnerability. There's so many of them. I don't worry about it. I think in the end, we need, as human beings, we need empathy to rise. There is so much confusion over what this is. Maybe we can talk about it today, exactly what it is. But for me, whether it's a buzzword or it's a trend, or it doesn't matter as long as it's rising. When I look back at my own journey, and I started this work about 5 years ago, nobody was inviting me on their podcasts, right? Nobody wanted to talk about empathy and leadership there. There was no interest in it. Today, of course, that's changed, and I get to travel the world and talk to people about it. So no, I think I don't worry. I think, my focus and perhaps the things that we can do together in this team is look at how we educate Maldivian businesses and corporates, even policymakers here, as to why we need to reconnect our businesses and our world.
Right.
And if it trends, then all the better.
Okay. Then do you believe in the notion that, empathy is universal, right? Or is it a luxury that only the, stable and secure can afford?
No, it's definitely universal. It's universal. I can say that 100%. There is a very tiny part of the population, 0.02% of people who are born without or with less empathy because of neurological issues, challenges in the brain. But for the majority of human beings, we are born with this. It is a choice whether to use it or not. And actually, you talked, or at least you sort of insinuated there, kind of the difference between the masses and perhaps its privilege or power. But actually, what we see, Aslan, is that in more communal living, so within people who live in more collectivist groups and societies, which tend to be people slightly lower down the income scale, you see higher levels of natural empathy. Okay. So, for example, you're going to see higher levels of empathy all over Asia, into Africa, into the Middle East, than you would in the West. Part of the reason for that is that people in the West are living behind their four walls, behind their garden fences. They're not living in community anymore. So absolutely, empathy is for everyone, and you were born with it. So it's up to you. It's up to you to use it.
Depends on who uses it and how it's used,
Exactly.
Right? Okay. I mean, there's this paradox that I think that exists, right? If I'm being too empathetic, I'm taken advantage of. if not, I'm considered as cold, right? Do you think that we're sort of stuck in this emotional paradox?
I think people are confused about what it is because, as you said, that insight there, which is if I'm being too empathetic, I'm going to be taken advantage of. But the reality is you won't, because there's no such thing as too much empathy. Empathy is fundamentally data. The more of it that you have, the better you are at negotiating, collaborating, managing.
Oh.
You find empathy used in the Army's handbooks, so the USA, the FBI.
Correct.
Use empathy as a key tool to change behavior in hostage negotiations. So actually, the more empathy you use, the less likely you are to be manipulated or, seen as soft, that type of thing. So it's a really common misconception. So no, I don't think the paradox is between too much or too little. I think it's more just around mass understanding of what this is and why we need it, and then how we use it, especially in business. We're talking about negotiation, management, procurement, looking at new customers. There's a book actually by Satya Nadella, who is the CEO of Microsoft. It's called Hit Refresh. It's a great book. It's not new, maybe 10 years old. He talks about turnaround of Microsoft. And in that book, he talks about empathy 52 times. And not just between people, but in looking at new innovation, new market segments, market entry, product development, customer experience, innovation pipeline.
Right.
So, no, I don't think we have necessarily that paradox. I think there are many paradoxes all the time, but I think that one is probably more around education.
Okay. Since we talked a bit about, since you mentioned, that about manipulation, do you think that there are people who fake empathy to get their point across? Or like, have you ever had to do that maybe?
Now, I think that if you try and fake empathy, people will be able to notice it immediately. It will come across as extremely insincere or indeed, unrealistic. People know. Because empathy is such a human trait, when people are using it without meaning, without intention, it's that feeling when you're maybe at a networking event and there's someone going, "Oh, Hassan, it's so nice to see you, mate, like so happy," and you go away thinking, "What an idiot." They didn't do that. So it's very easy to, in English, people say smell a rat, right? You can pick it out from a crowd. So it's very hard to fake empathy. You're either interested in understanding or you're not. And I think the core of empathy is to understand that this is not about agreeing and it's not about liking. So I can really hate what you're saying, but understand it.
Right.
But it has to be authentic. You have to authentically want to understand others, the perspective of others.
That's quite interesting. I wonder, there are people, that say that empathy sort of slows down decision making, often in terms of crisis, right? What are your thoughts on that?
So no, I don't think it would slow things down. I think the reality is that in order to be able to understand others, to listen, you have to take some time. So if there is, like you said, a crisis or something happens, in that initial phase, yes, you have to pause. You can't listen while running to the next meeting, right? It has to be something that you do actively. But in the long run, or even in the medium term, to be honest, it's going to speed things up because you understand your audience, your stakeholders, your constituents, whoever it is. You have data around how to solve the problem. Your risk reduces. The opportunity for mistakes goes down.
Yeah.
So actually, you're actually speeding things up. But you may need to invest a little bit of time up front to really understand that, especially, as you said, if it's crisis time, to really understand what's going on with your audience.
All right. I have another question. Do you think there's a point where empathy ever becomes dangerous? We often see that it gets disguised as an excuse for bad behavior, right? What do you think about that?
Look, I think with all human facets, with all human skill sets, with all human character traits, how you use them will change based on the choice of that person. So the reality is, in the world, there are bad people, and bad people will use good skills in bad ways. So there is always a risk. There is always a risk, but not just with empathy. You can manipulate compassion, you can manipulate kindness, you can manipulate care, and people do all around the world, all the time. Whether that's within corruption, whether it's within something awful like human trafficking, where people are using these skill sets to convince others of certain behaviors. So I think, unfortunately, as a human race, there will always be a small percentage of people that take these skill sets and use them in ways that are not desirable. But luckily, you and I are not those people.
Yeah.
So we are safe.
So eventually it comes down to the how and the who, right?
Yeah, it's a choice. If you want to behave badly and be corrupt and they, treat people like you wouldn't want to be treated yourself, we can't change other people's behavior. In the end, only you can change your behavior. I can give you information, I can give you training, I can give you data and evidence, but you're the one in the end that has to go into your meetings, into your life, into your role, and make the decisions about how you behave.
Okay, Mimi, let's talk about empathy on a global scale, right? You often speak to CEOs and policymakers, right? How often are the voices of small island nations such as us talked about, and do us small island nations or small nations like us, without any power, afford such a thing as empathy?
Look, I think you absolutely afford empathy. Whether those leaders globally are talking about the Maldives, I would suspect the reality is probably not, unless it benefits them, because that's how the corporate world and much of the political world works. Having said that, I think that the Maldives as an island nation is rising in awareness and engagement. You have phenomenal Maldivians doing amazing things all around the world. So I don't think that the levels of empathy, as you sort of mentioned, they're afforded to the nation are actually relevant to that. When I spend time here, I am amazed by the creativity, by the diligence, by the openness to learning and growth that you find in Mali. In what is a very small city, but there's a huge amount of potential here. And of course, tourism is your driving force on the islands, but there's more than that. There's more than that in your people. So I think whether or not global policymakers and CEOs are talking about you is actually far less relevant to how much you're able to talk about yourselves, right? How you can take Maldives to the world and prove that you're worth listening to.
All right. In that very sense, do you think it's still sort of the global empathy conversation? Do you think that is still very much dominated by the Western framework?
I think that's a really interesting question, but I think not, actually. Most of my work, nearly all of it, is in the East. So Asia, the Middle East and Gulf, and even down through Africa. So the kind of more eastern, at least east and southern side of the world. And the frequency within which I'm able to have these conversations here is definitely higher. But I also think because our nations are a little smaller, certainly the ones I specialize in, the Maldives, Sri Lanka, it's far easier for me to reach people like CEOs, policymakers in these smaller nations. I mean, it's very unlike him to walk into the White House and in TC, But here and in many of these countries, I get to work with many more decision makers more often because our communities are smaller and our nations are smaller. So I think the conversation is rising very fast here. If I think about Sri Lanka, for example, where I do a lot of work, I noticed a significant change in the middle of 2025. I don't know what sparked it. Perhaps just time. Perhaps it was just the right time. Not just in the understanding of empathy and emotional intelligence in the workplace, but also things like mental health, employee well-being, inclusion in the workplace. It was as if suddenly it all caught up. And that is probably because Sri Lanka, in this case, is coming out of some crisis years from COVID, political, economic collapses. They're now able to have a far more future-facing mindset. So I think the speed of change is very fast here. I now do a lot more work in the US. And of course, they're louder. The USA is the loudest nation in the world when it comes to kind of share of voice in the media. So you might feel like they're talking about it more, but I think actually the balance is quite equal.
That's quite interesting. That's quite pleasing to hear. And I think a lot of us feel like empathy should be somehow rewarded with justice, right? And when it's not, most of us are quite disappointed, right? Do you think that is still empathy? Even though it's not rewarded with justice.
Look, I think there's a very different thing between empathy and action. And the act of understanding, so the act of using that human data to understand others, and I'm making assumptions on what your question was, right? But in understanding a nation or in understanding large groups of people who are seeking justice for something, there is a difference between I understand them and I will act on behalf of them. more for them. All right. So there is definitely a difference between empathy and justice. I think one would hope that higher levels of empathy result in higher levels of justice in all kinds of environments. In fact, in the US, they have a concept called restorative justice. As restorative justice is a process where people who have been convicted of violent crimes, normally against women, so that could be sexual crimes, it could be violent crimes, it could be domestic abuse, it could be something more severe, where they will put the criminal and the victim together in a conversation like this, and they teach them through conversation to have empathy for each other in order to find justice on both sides of that. I think it's an incredibly difficult process, but it has very successful outcomes, even for the victims who have been, obviously their lives have been hugely impacted by terrible things. When they are able to use that empathy on that path to finding justice in their point of view, it goes up. So I think they're different things, but I think they're very tightly linked.
When we're being empathetic, like in any interpersonal, situation or relationship, we often find that sometimes does not get reciprocated, right? And that's quite exhausting. Do you think unreciprocated empathy, or rather burnout is the result of unreciprocated empathy?
I think it's a really interesting concept. I think probably in some ways, yes, because you're right. It's exhausting, actually. If you are trying to build a partnership where you are building trust, you're building rapport, you're building understanding between you, and you're never getting it back, yes, I think you probably will burn out. You will be exhausted, not by the empathy, but by the effort, right? By the effort of trying to connect with someone and it failing. Burnout itself is a result of a lack of purpose in 90% of occasions. So people often think that in the workplace, burnout is because I'm working too hard, I'm tired. But the tiredness is actually just a physical symptom of the burnout. The burnout is coming from lack of purpose. So if I give you an example, you're working on a big new business process document, and you feel like you're really making progress with the team and your boss is listening to you and you guys are working towards this big new business growth project. You're all in it together.
Right.
And they say, can you come in the weekend? You're like, yes, let's do it. You keep going. They ask you to come in the evening, go on Monday, you're ready. If that same project, you feel that you don't have a voice, nobody cares what you say anyway, you're not interested in the design document, your boss just wants what he wants. When he says, hey, Hassan, could you pop in on Saturday? You're like, sorry, I'm with my grandmother. Right? You don't want to do it. And that's what results eventually in burnout. That lack of purpose exhausts you. So it's not the empathy itself, but that, like you were talking about, reciprocation of emotion. Yeah. Fundamentally, the psychological need underneath that is to be understood, to belong. And when someone doesn't give it back to you, that emotion that you're feeling is a very evolutionary response. And it's that you don't belong. And therefore, your brain understands that as risk, as danger, because the brain is built in such a way to understand safety in groups. And when you keep trying and you keep getting pushed out, the response to that is a fear response.
So despite all that, right, how do you still keep your emotional center when, everyone sort of wants to be heard rather than listen to you? How do you keep your emotional center?
Look, I think that's a challenge for many people right now because the whole world is obsessed, as you just said, with getting heard, right? So in the world of personal branding and social media, everyone is shouting louder. As AI really increases the amount of content that we're creating all the time, that is just only going to go up. How loud can I shout? The reality is it's not about shouting now. I say often in my training, I do a lot of courses around keynote speaking and building your brand. And what I always say to people is it's not about shouting louder. It's about being more impactful. And there are many ways, to sustain that. I think that to find your emotional center amongst the noise and amongst the speed, because social media will make it look like every podcast is like a huge success tomorrow, which of course it isn't, right? You have to launch, you have to start somewhere. And if we post this and watch for the likes all day, we'll be like, did they like the show? It's going to drive you mad. Patience is such an asset. to understand that what's meant for you will come for you, but it's not going to come right now, right? So,
Yeah, it's not going to be instant gratification, right?
and we have to be patient. And I know that's just not the way the world works, but it is a huge asset to be able to master it. So I think patience helps. I also think tenacity, which is a word that many non-native English speakers really understand. So tenacity means sort of hard work meets resilience. So tenacity is that ability to just get up and do it again, to keep going. Those are the things, at least in my experience, that help that emotional center, because you're constantly aware, I'm going to give it another go, right? I'm going to give it another go. I'm going to carry on. And I promise you, Aslan, I think I mentioned this earlier, but when I started, I had 300 connections on LinkedIn about 4.5 years ago. In July, our analytics showed that in the last 120 days, we reached 2.5 million people. And that's just, it is honestly, when I read it, I was like, what? This is my, is it
Congratulations, yeah. You absolutely deserve it, yeah.
But that is just one step in front of the other every day for 4 years. No media, no rush, no pace, just consistency. So that's how I experience resilience. That's how I find my emotional center.
Yeah. And as for my final question, we're almost at the end of the podcast. For my final question, I want to ask you, do you think there's something that the world, as it is right now, needs to unlearn about empathy?
No, I think that there's nothing to unlearn, because there's still such a gap in defining it. But I think that what they probably do need to unlearn is the fear of what it might mean, especially in this region. You touched on this insight earlier, which is, will it make me weak? We have to unlearn the rhetoric that leadership and success comes from shouting and aggression. And when I say aggression, I just mean aggressive behavior. For example, even in language, let's defeat the competition, right? Let's kill the insight. Can we stop talking about defeating and killing, right? That real kind of aggressive approach to winning. We have been told for so long that is the only way. So I think in that form, that's something we do need to unlearn. We need to unlearn that everything needs to happen tomorrow. We need to unlearn that everything needs to be scaled. Everything doesn't need to be.
Yeah, it doesn't.
Right?
Yeah.
There is such a thing as depth. There is such a thing as authenticity and grace. I guess more so probably for women than men, but graciousness is as relevant to men as well. So I think we need to unlearn that all of those very tough-edged, very harsh business tactics and corporate tactics are the only way. I think there's many other ways to build businesses, to build brands, to create belonging, to build communities, to start an NGO, whatever it is, fuel your tech startup. And that needs unlearning. We need a new message that tells our young people, particularly, that there are different and far more sustainable ways to build your future.
Thank you very much, Mimi. With that, our first episode of the Mind Unravelling podcast comes to an end. And once again, thank you, Mimi, so much for honoring us with your presence and sharing these insightful stories. And for you, I hope that was as informative and insightful as it was for me. And tune in and keep watching this space for our next episodes.